A common rule that League's reworks follow, or at least try to, is the notion of preservation. Even for the drastically altered champions, the goal is to preserve some semblance of their identity so as not to dishonor their past version. Backlash against Aatrox's rework was fueled almost entirely by the impression that Riot could have maintained his previous state as is and released the current one as a new standalone champion. At the time, for many, myself included, Aatrox's rework illustrated a total lack of respect for what made reworks before so successful and well received: preservation. Objectively speaking though, his present form is excellently designed, and while his damage is exerted now in the form of abilities rather than previously auto attacks, Aatrox was and still is a Juggernaut, one who charges into the middle of the enemy team and raid bosses his way through sheer drain tanking. One could argue his identity was preserved, just not the way many of us were hoping for. Of course, not every champion was preserved. Some had to almost entirely be phased out of the game for better or worse, replaced by a new identity that's retrofitted to match the standards of modern League of Legends. Sion and Poppy were two noteworthy examples, and I plan to make a piece on each one later down the road. But there's another that was given the same kind of treatment, and I'd have to say this is a very unexpected yet creative way to reimagine a champion. So let's investigate how the Dreadnought's overhaul demonstrated that maybe starting from square one isn't always a bad thing. Today's video will be on Urgot's Rework, a retrospective. But first, a word from our sponsor, FaceCheck. FaceCheck is an Overwolf companion app that conveniently provides you important information to help you during your climb. Rather than manually searching up stuff like player data, item builds, champion stats, what have you, FaceCheck gives you all that without you having to do anything. While Enchant Select lets you import runes, builds, and summoner spells directly to your League client from the overlay, and displays information of your teammates' stats to see if anyone's autofill or what kind of playstyles they have. You can also use it to find out if someone's on a winning or losing streak or if there are smurfs on the enemy team. When in game, life stats are shown for the enemy team as well, including player cards detailing their strengths and weaknesses, like if they're aggressive or passive early, or if they have good or bad vision score. One of my favorite features is the enemy team's damage distribution, which updates over the course of a match, so you can figure out if you need more armor or magic resist based on who is fed on the enemy team. When the game is over, you get a full analysis of your personal performance, including how well you did in comparison to your lane opponent, what you did right and wrong in others, so you can see what you need to work on. It's a very helpful app that can help you stay up to date on things, so I highly suggest you check it out via the link on screen or in the description. As always, a pleasure to work with FaceCheck once again, but for now, let's get back into it. As one of League's most obscure champions prior to his VGU, Urgot was Riot's first attempt at designing a true ability caster marksman. Ezreal primarily relied on Mystic Shot for his DPS, but he still had to weave in auto attacks to maximize his damage. In essence, old Urgot was designed to behave like an AD version of Cassiopeia at a time where such a concept was rather dubious. Prior to him, there were less than 60 champions in the game, and more than half would be labeled as a stat checker at minimum. Naturally, the scope of innovation was underdeveloped back then, hamstringing Urgot's design in a way that prevented him from really shining through. That being said, his old version raised a lot of interesting questions. Marksmen at the time and even now are famous for their extreme persistent damage, capable of supplying the entirety of their team's necessary physical pressure. In exchange, they require ample support and protection from their allies in light of how vulnerable they are to divers, tanks, and assassins. Moreover, virtually all of their DPS was exercised through auto attacks, relying on attack speed, on-hit effects, and crit damage to supplement. Urgot was a marksman who effectively didn't rely on auto attacks whatsoever. More surprising was how independent he was, relatively speaking, thanks to his oppressive neutral game and deceptively strong dueling potential. AD carries didn't have the luxury to deviate in their item builds, as crit items had all of their power budget allocated towards attack damage, attack speed, and crit chance. But since Urgot didn't need crit chance, he was able to play around with his options, creating an entirely different win condition, gameplay, and experience. However, in a similar fashion to Kayle, he was the first of his kind, and therefore had no frame of reference to gauge how effective he was supposed to be. By extension, his playstyle made it difficult for players to adjust to him by using other marksmen as a benchmark. For example, it's pretty easy to transition from the likes of Twitch or Caitlyn to Ashe since they have the same mechanics more or less. Urgot was for all intents and purposes a specialist, in that you couldn't view him in the same lens as a typical marksman, whether playing as him or against him. Acid Hunter was Urgot's main damage source. On a 2-second cooldown and a target range of 1000, it did a small amount of base damage plus 85% of his AD. The numbers would ultimately average out to be a little bit stronger than a regular auto attack. If he kills the target, he would refund half of the mana cost. Something to make note of is that Acid Hunter applied no on-hit effects or critical strikes, making it a bona fide damaging ability and not an empowered auto attack. At first glance, it appears to simply be a worse version of Ezreal's Mystic Shot, and it was. That is, until he landed his E. Noxian Corrosive Charge would fire an explosive canister that would inflict damage over time to all enemies in a small area, reducing their armor in the process. For 5 seconds afterwards, Urgot was able to directly target anyone struck by the ability, transforming Acid Hunter from straight-line missiles to long-range heat-seeking ordnance. The range would also increase from 1000 to 1200, far enough for him to challenge artillery mages in poke. He used to actually be 1500 before it got nerfed. Imagine if Ezreal's Q became point and click. That's basically what Urgot's Q was when empowered. If he managed to land corrosive charge on his lane opponent, he would get at least 2 Acid Hunters on them for free, and with 40% cooldown reduction, that number would go to 4 or 5. It may not seem like a whole lot in theory, but also remember the reduced armor in tandem with his usual build path at the time. Additionally, his passive NW made it so fighting him while locked onto was a battle most ADCs or even melee champions could not win. Zontouch Bolt Augmenter caused his basic attacks in Acid Hunter to reduce his target's damage towards him by 15% for 2.5 seconds. That's it. Unconditional damage reduction. If you were fighting him, he had a mini exhaust at all times. Terror Capacitor was a shield that scaled off his maximum mana, and while the shield held, basic attacks in Acid Hunter would slow his target for 1.5 seconds. Essentially, if you were struck by a corrosive charge, you were almost guaranteed to lose trades. You could no longer hide behind your minion wave or a fellow teammate. Running away was also not an option. You not only had to deal with Acid Hunter's extended range, but also the slow. Fighting back was undesirable as well since you were tagged with 15% damage reduction, and for the longest time that mattered a lot. Remember, this is during a time when stuff like percent health damage and true damage were still a rarity. Oh, and just to remind you, Terror Capacitor is a shield that scaled with mana. Once you got Muramana and Frozen Heart, that became a big ass shield. You weren't winning those trades, I don't care who you were. Trying to win all-ins was even more challenging thanks to Hyperkinetic Position Reverser, the weirdest ability in the game. A point and click that rooted Urgot in place while suppressing a target champion for 1 second. Upon completing the channel, if it wasn't obvious from the name, both of them would swap places. Urgot would gain 30 to 50% damage reduction for 5 seconds based on rank. The target enemy champion would be slowed by 40% for 3 seconds, and any other hostile entity near him would be feared for 1.5. Yes, in theory, Urgot was a marksman who could engage. You couldn't find a stat checkier ADC than this guy. 50% damage mitigation on himself, plus 15% damage reduction on you, plus 20% armor reduction on you, plus a shield, plus a long range point and click attack. Urgot's entire game plan was to overwhelm you by carrying a big ass stick. It was a very degenerate strategy, yet surprisingly it never actually took off. One would imagine that with how flowcharty and honestly brain dead easy Urgot was to play, that he would have a very high presence in the meta. Who doesn't want an ADC with point and click lockdown and durability to that extent? The answer to that can be found in how that flowchart begins. Urgot lived and died by Acid Hunter. That was his main and sometimes only source of damage. He did have auto attacks, but without attack speed and crit chance, those auto attacks weren't doing a whole lot of damage. By itself though, Acid Hunter was a straight line skill shot, exactly like Ezreal's Q. For it to become point and click, the target would have to be affected by Noxian Corrosive Charge, a mid-ranged area skill shot on a 15-second cooldown at rank 1. If you missed Urgot's E, you had no pressure for 15 seconds. As a result, Urgot had one of the jankiest early games of all time. His cooldowns were way too long back then. Terror Capacitor at 16 seconds and Corrosive Charge at 15. On top of that, even if you landed every single E, you can only land 2 point and click Acid Hunters during that time. His damage output was pitiful up until you brought Corrosive Charge's cooldown to 11 seconds and stacked 40% CDR for more frequency in your EQ combos. But to be able to do that, you needed mana, and Urgot's mana costs were steep, very steep. Until 2 items, he was basically KO levels of useless. Thing is, his kit was too oppressive to be allowed consistency, at the very least in the early game, putting him in a very problematic balance dilemma. Acid Hunter's enhanced range was 1200, letting him attack you from almost an entire screen. For that reason, it would be unfair for Corrosive Charge to have a short cooldown. Comparatively, Cassiopeia's Twin Fang is always point and click, has a far shorter cooldown, and fully refunds the mana cost on kill, while Noxious Blast has a 3.5 second cooldown, making her more consistent. She's allowed that concession because Twin Fang's range is only 700 units. It's short enough to where whoever she's firing at can fire right back. At 1200 units, hardly anyone can match that, giving Urgot free harass. The issue was that Urgot was so reliant on Corrosive Charge to do just about anything, since Acid Hunter was a pretty garbage ability otherwise. Were that the case, why didn't they just reduce the max range on Q? Well, they did. It used to be 1500 when empowered, and besides, Urgot range had to be that far for him to really do anything. He was a marksman with 0 mobility unless you count his ultimate, and he also had really bad wave clear and poor DPS. Since he had to focus on a mixture of cooldown reduction, mana, and durability, Urgot's mid-game was very strong, but his damage would fall off a cliff in the late game. Range was the only thing that kept him relevant. Hell would freeze over before Acid Hunter's DPS beat out a marksman with 400 AD, 100% crit chance plus infinity edge, and 2.0 attack speed. With all this in mind, it was clear that Urgot's root problem was that he just couldn't hack it as a marksman. So they axed the entire project, which sucks because personally I think it was a really cool premise. They just had to approach things in a different way. Ultimately, they sort of revisited the concept several years later with the advent of Zeri, but I would have preferred if they stuck with the tanky Juggernaut artillery marksman theme. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Urgot may very well be the only rework in League of Legends that fully changed what role he was designed for. While it's true that we've had more extreme VGUs like Galio and Poppy, they more or less remained in the same place. On the other hand, Urgot was ousted away from bot lane and into top, where they doubled down on his Juggernaut-like experience. Thematically, I would have rather they pushed in the other direction, but admittedly, this path was the more stable and secure one, so I suppose they ended up reducing Urgot's effective range after all. Noxian Corrosive Charge survived the transition, albeit with a few tweaks. Instead of damage over time, it's now just flat damage that slows all enemies hit, and it's been moved to his Q. Miraculously, Hyperkinetic Position Reverser also held steady. Well, it's debatable, but there's a lot of resemblance. No longer his ultimate, it was renamed to Disdain and placed on his E, where he dashes forward and grabs the first enemy champion struck while flinging them over his shoulder before stunning them in place. So in a way, it was kind of like his old ultimate, just not as strong. As the Hunter was supplanted by Perch, a stance change that causes Urgot to fire 3 rounds per second at modified damage. On initial launch, Terror Capacitor Shield was attached to his W, now of course it's on his E. Despite his present kit consisting of spiritual successors to his old one, Urgot's experience was vastly altered courtesy of his new passive and ultimate, and that new passive and ultimate would cement his new identity as a slow but brutal death machine. Echoing Flames arms each of his crab legs with a shotgun. Anytime he attacks within the arc of a shotgun, it will explode in that direction, dealing up to 100% of his attack damage plus bonus max health damage to all enemies hit. Essentially, it's a crit strike with max health damage on the primary target, and an AoE attack to everything else around it. Masterful usage of Purge and Disdain allows you to proc all of his legs within a single rotation on the same champion, and in the late game the damage is catastrophic. 600% of his total AD plus 36% max health damage off of just his passive alone. True to his new designation as a Juggernaut, he can bring a lot of pain in the right circumstances. Speaking of pain, Urgot's new ultimate grants him insane playmaking potential. Many players fear this ability because of the execute, but in my opinion you should be more afraid of the AoE fear. Hyperkinetic Position Reverse's AoE fear has carried over to Fear Beyond Death, which executes a target champion if they fall under 25% of their max health. With a target range of 2500, it's a semi-global ultimate. This is one of the coolest playmaking abilities in the game. A crippling weakness of old Urgot was that he was exclusively single target, limiting how much pressure he could apply. New Urgot is also primarily single target, but has enough AoE coverage in his kit to make him just as terrifying in a 5v5 teamfight as the likes of Darius, Mordekaiser, Set, Aatrox, etc. And that's ultimately what Juggernauts are. They have strong dueling potential with applicable pressure against multiple targets if need be. With so much more damage added to his repertoire, his scaling was stabilized to be more progressive over time. Another pressing issue with old Urgot was that he didn't really do very much. So in typical stat checker fashion, Riot was forced to load him with free stats like armor reduction, damage mitigation, and so on. In comparison, his new kit looks very overloaded, and depending on who you ask, it is. But he's allowed to have all this now that his effective range has been significantly reduced. That said, there were a few janks that had to be ironed out. Urgot still suffered from a disappointingly weak early game, and it didn't improve very much as time went on. Echoing Flames' cooldown was extremely long, rendering him useless for big chunks of time. Additionally, he was very clunky even for the standards of Juggernauts and was severely lacking in persistent damage. Part of what makes Juggernauts dangerous is that they excel both in short burst trades and protracted engagements. Urgot was only good at the former. Fortunately, Riot took notice quickly and gave him the adjustments necessary to fix those problems. First, in patch 7.21, Echoing Flames' cooldown went from 10 seconds at level 13 to 2.5, a huge boost to his DPS in the mid to late game. To complement that, in patch 9.6, Purge was changed to where it acts as a toggle ability at max rank on top of having no mana cost, greatly increasing his persistent damage and allowing him to make use of the faster recharge rate on his legs. Furthermore, version 8.11 made it so that he could still move around during his ultimate animation, giving rise to the flash ult combo that you've no doubt seen Urgot players use a lot. Finally, 10.6 oversaw Corrosive Charge's slow duration increased to 1.25 seconds from 1, and in 10.8, Disdain's stun duration is now 1.5 seconds. This gives Urgot more time to reposition for more shotgun bursts on his target of interest. These were fantastic quality of life changes that granted Urgot just enough opportunity to exert the full force of his pressure without making him feel too oppressive to deal with. Disdain's immense shield and amazing lockdown potential is kept in check by the short dash and long cooldown. Purge's infinite duration and no mana cost is offset by his modified damage and dependence on Echoing Flames for the bulk of his DPS. And can I just say for the record, Urgot's passive has to be one of the most clever ways to design a passive and by extension a playstyle. He was always memed on for being a crab, even in his old version. I mean, his first skin is literally Crab God, so they doubled down on it and turned his crab legs into an actual part of his gameplay. Speaking of which, every part of Urgot's body is a weapon. His legs are the shotguns, his oversized left arm is used to grab and toss people behind him with disdain, his right arm, which has been transformed into a machine gun, is used for a purge, the canisters for corrosive charge are attached to the side of his machine gun, and finally, the massive meat grinder that is his torso is what fires the drill from Fear Beyond Death. Urgot's new visuals are beyond stellar. He transformed from a mutated chunky boy into a brutish man-turned chemtech machine, one of the most drastic yet striking changes to this day. As far as gameplay is concerned, each of his abilities have a specific function that leads into one another. His kit is easy to understand and pick up while leaving plenty of room for skill expression, and all of his abilities have exactly what they need to be conducive to what he wants to do. True, his kit looks complicated, but there's nothing within it that doesn't belong there. As such, he's a very stable champion that brings a lot to the table for any top laner's roster, strong enough to carry games if played correctly, with just enough counterplay to prevent him from being 200 years. I will concede that Urgot's rework bears a lot of similarity to Aatrox. Could they have released his existing version as a separate champion while keeping the old one? Yes, but unlike Aatrox, old Urgot as a concept wasn't gonna work in the first place. He's a tanky bruiser marksman who's unable to take advantage of crit chance or even on hit effects for that matter. Moreover, his pressure was too inconsistent and too reliant on a single ability. In other words, he was never meant to be a marksman, as entertaining as it was. This rendition is how Urgot was meant to be. Easily one of the best out of all the radically transformed visual gameplay updates, second only to probably Warwick. That's gonna be it for today. My voice is dying on me, so if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Consider following me on Twitter at Vars, joining my Discord server, and checking out my other retrospectives if you haven't yet. Until next time though, thank you all so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.